Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to have in our midst Jayson Merkley, who is a native of Idaho City. He holds a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a master's degree in business administration from Idaho State University. Jayson is the director of Vegan GMO, an organization that promotes biotech from the perspective of vegans and animal advocates. He's also a 2015 Alliance for Science Global Leadership. Headquartered in Saskatoon. He has also delivered presentations in Texcoco Research Institute in Mexico. He is a prolific writer of biotechnology, climate change, veganism, and science activism, which has appeared in different outlets, including SciDev.net and also on the Alliance for Science blog. Today, he will be speaking on building the ethical vegan case for biotechnology. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jayson Merkley.
Thank you very much, Eric. Appreciate that introduction. That was great. Wow, what a week to be preparing a presentation. Everything that's going on in U.S. politics, I don't know if some of you fellows have been following it, but for us United States citizens, it's been a crazy ride. It's been kind of interesting and sort of relevant to what I want to talk about in looking at how all these politics have played out over the last few months in the political campaign. Just from the perspective of watching people, it's interesting to see how we sort of align ourselves into these separate tribes, like the Democrats versus the Republicans, for example, in the presidential election. This seems to happen so often. We find ourselves taking sides or representing one team or another. And as we saw in the political debates, oftentimes when people looked on the surface like they were discussing facts, what was actually happening was more of one tribe trying to defend itself from attacks from another tribe. So if a fact can be taken as an attack against the legitimacy of my tribe, that could impact my ability to evaluate the truth value of that fact. And this is really relevant to what I'm talking about today because, take me for example, my tribe is the vegans. The vegans are my people. I haven't eaten meat or animal products for nearly 19 years. So if somebody comes to me with a claim, for example, that calls into question the legitimacy of my position as a vegan, then my ability to evaluate that claim might be somewhat compromised. So I think that we all need to be aware of the tribes that we consider ourselves part of and how that affects our ability to evaluate facts. Many of you in this room perhaps might find that just by being presented with the idea of veganism, you're resorting to sort of a knee-jerk reaction to your own mental defense of team meat eater, and that might even make you more resistant to evaluating some of the claims that I make. So you might take a second to ponder that. By the way, Dan Kahan at Yale University has done some really interesting research on the way that that claims are evaluated based on our sort of tribal allegiances. And I recommend anybody who's interested in science communication should definitely Google Dan Kahan and look at his research. So let me move forward to vegan GMO. Here's our mission statement. We're advocating for a rational approach toward biotechnology and the ongoing struggle for animal justice. And And based on what I've been talking about as far as allegiances to tribal organizations, then maybe you can anticipate some of the challenges that we face at Vegan GMO. If we look back in time about 20 years to the start of when GMO started becoming commercialized in the United States, a lot of people sort of on the political left end of our spectrum, sort of people concerned about environmental protection, concerned about consumer protection, made some really snap judgments based on, at the time, what was the best available evidence and inputs. For many vegans, that consisted mainly of sort of scary, negative narratives. And I think in the beginning, a lot of us sort of leaned anti-GMO. And over time, that sort of became incorporated into our sense of identity and what it means to be vegan. So nowadays, if you go into a vegan forum online, for example, you're likely to see in most of them a lot of anti-GMO narratives and repetition of claims coming from the anti-GMO camp. So if somebody comes into a vegan space and wants to call some of those claims into question, the ability of the vegan community to evaluate those claims can often be taken as, less about the truth value, is this true or not, and can be taken more personally and feel more like an attack on veganism itself. And that's why we feel it's important for us to approach this problem as vegans. So we're not an outside force questioning the legitimacy of veganism by this line of inquiry. We're trying to reinforce and strengthen the vegan position, because this is something that we truly believe in. These are our values. But why? Why care? Why should we care about GMOs as vegans? So our vegan identity is based on values and actions that have a specific end in mind. And I think more and more vegans are sort of waking up to the reality that blanket opposition to biotechnology, including GMOs, is taking us the opposite direction from the world that we would like to see actualized. So let's just talk for a minute and get on the same page about what is a vegan and what are these values that are so important. This is a statement from the Vegan Society. My friend Dave calls this sort of the vanilla definition, sort of a very safe definition of what veganism is. I think the important parts to look at here are excluding exploitation and cruelty. I think that we should pay attention to the subjectivity of this statement. There is room for any given vegan to evaluate how and to what extent it is practical and possible to avoid doing harm to animals. So, I'm not here to question anybody's vegan credentials or to point fingers and say, you're not vegan enough, you're not vegan enough. This is not about purity. This is about doing the best that we can as individuals and about trying to change the system to create the kind of world that we want to live in. So I think at the basis of the vegan philosophy, there's a moral imperative. Some people are vegan because they think it's healthier. Some people are vegan because they think it's good for the environment. But I think collectively our most common thread is this moral question, which I would paraphrase as, is it possible and practical to exclude exploitation and cruelty from our lifestyle? And if so, shouldn't we feel morally compelled to do so? So, I think that the general public and vegans as well often tend to have this idea about the crops that we have, the foods that we have, and imagine that the food we eat has always been the way that it is. That assumption doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Here's some examples of what foods that we currently enjoy used to look like before hundreds or thousands of years of genetic modification through conventional breeding. And, I don't mean to muddy the waters into, let's be clear that there are significant material differences between various forms of genetic modification. What we refer to as GMOs is, it's not the same thing as conventional breeding. I want to be clear about that. But I also want to point out that that we've been moving genes around for a long time. We know a lot about this stuff, and the more that we learn about it, the more arbitrary it starts to feel to single out any given form of genetic modification for criticism, because it turns out a lot of the criticisms sort of cut across all methods or are not individual to any one method. So people don't realize, we criticize GMOs and without realizing that this can occur in nature, this horizontal gene transfer. And in fact, anybody who's eaten a sweet potato has eaten a food that has been modified by nature using agrobacterium the same way that scientists might create GMOs in a lab today. Now, vegan GMOs coming from this position that when it comes to risk of genetically modified organisms, there's a broad scientific consensus that GMO crops do not pose any additional risk to humans or the environment over counterparts that are conventionally bred. This image is a reference to a report that came out earlier this year. It was a study that looked at over 900 different research papers done by the National Academies of Science. They sat down with people who had all kinds of different concerns about GMOs and possible negative outcomes. They listened to all of their concerns. They looked into all of them. And this was their conclusion at the end of the day, that there was no difference in risk between these organisms and conventionally bred organisms. Now, I want to point this out because when vegans promote a narrative that doesn't accept this, there can be actual harm done to animals, and I'll get into that later. Here's another list. These are probably too small for you to see, but these are various scientific and medical institutions that have also listed consensus statements on the safety or lack of additional risks posed by genetically modified crops. It includes prestigious bodies like the American Association for the Advancement of Science, American Medical Association, World Health Organization, National Academy of Sciences, Royal Society of Medicine, European Commission, goes on and on and on. So, we at Vegan GMO, we feel like this is a broadly accepted consensus. Now, consensus doesn't mean that nobody disagrees. Consensus isn't always proven right at the end of the day, but as we get more and more research, consensus becomes stronger and stronger, and I think that everybody has to say, looking at what's out there, that GMOs are one of the most studied technologies ever in any category. Now, one specific concern that vegans have that maybe is less important to the general public is with regard to animal testing. And in fact, many vegans have tried to say that GMOs across the board should not be considered vegan because they're tested on animals. This is a Twitter interaction that I had with the folks at Arctic Apples. I asked them, did you test on animals at any point during R&D of the product or getting it deregulated? And their answer was no. And so then I asked them, is that something we should be worried about? How would you respond to people who really want to see these animal tests? And their response, as you can see, was that the people might be surprised by how effective and comprehensive non-animal alternatives are. So with regard to animal testing, the anti-GMO narrative promotes this idea that we need more testing, and that creates higher demand for more lab animals to be processed in these tests and ultimately killed. So one thing that I think vegans should understand is that the companies who develop GMO technology don't want to do animal testing. They're not interested. They don't want to do it if they don't have to. And it's not because, Uncle Monsanto has such a big heart and doesn't want to hurt animals or anything like that. It's nothing like that. It's the fact that animal tests are very expensive, they're very time consuming, and they don't add a lot of useful knowledge at the end of the day. So when it comes to not adding useful knowledge, it stops becoming strictly a vegan issue, and it comes down to just the ethics of using animals in science held by all scientists. If a study on an animal is not giving us any useful information, then there are serious ethical questions about it. Here is a paper by Bartholomeus and colleagues where after reviewing several projects, they're saying that Whole Foods toxicity studies on animals, for example, are not telling us anything useful and therefore are morally questionable. So when it comes to Whole Foods testing, there's a reason that a lot of these Whole Foods tests are promoted by people who are advocating an anti-GMO narrative. And that's because these tests, they do not focus in on any single variables in the test. It's sort of, if you're eating a whole kernel of GMO maize, there are, however many hundreds or thousands of compounds. If there is an effect shown in the animal, there's no way to know what exactly it's caused by, if it's caused by any individual compound or by the different compounds interacting in a certain way. If there was concerns to be had about animals eating whole GMO foods, then we would expect them to show up in these studies that I referenced here. The first study by Dr. Alison van Eenenaam, often referred to as the Trillion Meal Study, looked at decades of data on farm animals. Didn't find any differences between the animals fed GMO foods versus animals who were fed conventional foods. The second study here looked at multi-generational animal feeding trials, a meta-analysis of those multi-generational animal feeding trials, and came to the same conclusion. So based on these studies, which have huge sample sizes, you would expect to see any problems appearing. The bigger the sample size is, the more accurate the big picture is that you get from it. And these ones are too big ones to look at. Now, as a vegan, I have to mention Seralini. I think that for a lot of people, he's something of a folk hero. And, maybe for some people's value systems that is appropriate. I would question whether any vegan ought to be hanging their hat on the Seralini study. So I think most of us in this room are probably familiar with what Seralini did. He took these rats, he fed them GMO maize with various concentrations of Roundup, glyphosate-based herbicide. The rats developed tumors and died, and he published pictures of them. Our vegan GMO team, and we're putting together this presentation, we kind of struggled over whether or not we wanted to show those images of the rats. I'm sure you've seen them all covered in these tumors. In the end of the day, we decided not to. We find them pretty disturbing. We find Seralini's methods to be pretty horrific. We think that in order for him to prove his point, whether or not these rats were developing tumors, as soon as the tumors emerged, he could have put these animals out of their misery. We don't see any value in allowing them to continue to live for the full 2-year duration of the study while these tumors grew and grew and ravaged the bodies of these poor animals, essentially so he could get some photographs that would be sensational enough to grab public attention and, help promote his book tour that happened shortly after he released the study. As vegans, we find this unacceptable, and we want other vegans to understand why. And again, we're talking about a threshold of ethics that is far below vegans' high standard. You have a quote here from Dr. Bruce Chassey, questioning the ethics of the study and saying that based on ethics alone, this paper could have or should have been retracted. As we all know, the paper was retracted and is not considered to be good science by mainstream researchers. So, let's change gears. Let's talk about some of the positives. Biotechnology can do a lot to take animals out of production for our food and for other goods. We can use biotechnology to create alternatives to the products that we like, that are culturally relevant, that are comfort foods, that are useful, and we can do it without animals involved. And you see here a few of the interesting companies and projects that are happening in this area. You see Real Vegan Cheese, Memphis Meats, Pembient, Clara Foods, Perfect Day, Spiber. I want to point out the Good Food Institute and New Harvest are two really interesting organizations that help fund research in this area, and they help collaborate research between various scientists working on these kinds of projects and help fund them. Pembient there in the middle, you see the little silhouette of the rhino horn. This is really interesting. In Africa we have problems with rhinoceros populations because poachers are trying to take them for their horns. This project is using genetic modification to create rhino horn, essentially, that when ground up down at the DNA level, you can't tell the difference between this synthetic stuff and the real stuff. And their idea is that by flooding the market with this synthetic, you lower the incentive for poachers to go out and take more rhinos. And this kind of innovative approach is something that is pretty cool. Memphis Meats is creating a meatless meatball. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Real Vegan Cheese is an awesome project that one of our vegan GMO buddies is working on, where they're using genetically modified yeast to create dairy proteins, which takes cows out of the equation for creating cheese. In this graphic, you can see on the top, that first strip is from the Real Vegan Cheese project. You can see the process, how they synthesize the dairy products by modifying the yeast with DNA from cows, or not just cows. They've also experimented with creating dairy proteins from other animals like narwhals or even human DNA to make human cheese, which is, I don't know, kind of weird. kind of gross. I don't think the FDA looked kindly upon that, so I don't think they're doing much research into human cheese anymore. But it's an interesting anecdote anyway. And then down below, you see in the how to grow beef in a lab, this is really interesting. So you take a little bit of cell from the animal, and then you can create a stem cell line and basically grow meat in a laboratory separate from an animal. So a very minimal impact on an animal from one single animal. You could take the starter cells, and ideally as the technology progresses, you could immortalize that stem cell line, and it would continue to produce cells over time. You would never need another cow ever again. Create hamburger meat that has no suffering involved, has a much greater efficiency in terms of inputs coming in, much smaller greenhouse gas footprint, and the nutritional profile of the meat can be changed to whatever we want. We can make the meat less fatty, healthier, have vitamins and nutrients that are not currently available in meat at the store. I talk about this project with a lot of vegans, and their reaction is just kind of like, that sounds gross, I don't want to eat that. And I say, that's fine, but look, you're missing the point. This is not for vegans. This is not creating a product for vegans. This is creating a product that can compete with the meat that's coming from animals. And the net effect on the overall market could be a reduction in the amount of animals that are being used for food. So another useful way that biotech can contribute to vegans is in spreading veganism. Vegan living can be made more accessible and convenient through biofortification and the other kinds of things we were just talking about. I think vegans also have a little bit of a PR problem. I think in the United States, vegans have a certain reputation where we're associated with kind of this fringe element, or we're considered irrational or silly, or people are, going back to tribe versus tribe, people who are not part of the vegan tribe are, they want to jump on any excuse possible to disregard what we're saying about animal suffering. And so if they can just disregard us because they see us as being silly and not being with the times, not being informed about science, then they will do that. So we think that by embracing science and technology and being progressive in this area, we can change the way that people think and talk about vegans and make it appear to be a much more interesting movement for your average non-vegan citizen. So we're compassionate people, and our compassion is not just for animals themselves. We also care a lot about humans. This map shows percentage of children in each of these countries that have vitamin A deficiency. I think one of the most publicized conversations happening in the biotech world is about golden rice, which is now undergoing field trials in Bangladesh, which is, we think is very exciting. But you can see on the map that this is a serious problem. There are, hundreds of thousands of people, predominantly children, pregnant women, who suffer and even die from vitamin A deficiency and other micronutrient deficiencies. And we feel like biotechnology is a great way to not solve the problem, but to give us another useful tool in addressing it. So as vegans, we have certain dietary needs that are maybe a little bit different from the general population. For example, B12 or other B vitamins are not really easy to get. A lot of us have to supplement for that. This is something that can be improved through biofortification potentially. Fatty omega acids are another thing that some vegans like to supplement. And even for people who supplement with fish oil, this is an animal product that that can be synthesized from, like this camelina project done by Rothamsted. We can get these fatty acids to the consumer in a way that doesn't involve any fish or any animals, and that's something we're excited about. The Arctic apple there, I got to taste that last year. It tasted like a normal apple. It's great. A lot of vegans, and not just vegans, a lot of people talk about our food system and they say we don't need to grow more food, we just need to stop the waste. And what I want to say to those people is that yes, we have a lot of waste and it needs to improve if we're gonna go forward and we're gonna feed people. Biotechnology is gonna help us here, and that's exactly what the Arctic apple trade is all about, in preventing browning, preventing apples becoming less palatable because they look brown and get tossed out. So when it comes to agriculture, we have to think not just about feeding all the people in the world right now. We have to look forward to the challenges of feeding the world in the next 20, 30, 50 years. And we have to be mindful of the complications of climate change. You can see in this image here, we're looking at the effects of agriculture outputs if the world went up by 3 degrees Celsius. Now, last year we had the COP21 agreements where everybody got together and said, yeah, this is going to be great. We're going to limit it to only going up by 2 degrees. But with recent political developments, I think there is still a lot of doubt about whether or not we can accomplish it. And even if we can, if some of the bigger countries like the United States are even really going to be that interested in sticking to that. But either way, biotechnology is useful in addressing both mitigating the effects of climate change and adjusting to them when they get here. So some of the problems that are associated with climate change and agriculture, a lot of people in this room know a lot more about this than I do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but flood, drought, salinity from encroaching seawaters, diseases that thrive in certain tropical climates that are now spreading north and south as temperatures increase, spoilage, the possibility of climate refugees as people flee from areas that are going underwater as ocean levels rise. And so as these people migrate into urban areas, they can take down the whole infrastructure that's in some of these places is already not suitable for current populations. So we can't just create more new farmland. We're stuck with what we've got on the planet. We've got to find ways to create more with less land. And biotechnology is really important for that. The papaya you see on the right here is a classic example of how GMO technology can be used for disease resistance. It's credited with saving the papaya industry in Hawaii. This is a technology that was developed here at Cornell. It was not a big corporation. This is scientists working for the public good and the technology given to farmers to put it into use. BT corn is something that I think vegans can be excited about. By putting BT directly into the corn, then it has significantly reduced insecticide sprays. And insecticide sprays are sort of applied in a way that affects more than just the intended insect, the threatening insect. So these sprays can hurt other animals, other insects, and by reducing the insecticide, by putting the BT directly into the corn, vegans, I think, can view this as a positive. Another really interesting project at Rothamsted is the Wiffy wheat project, which you guys are probably familiar with. Unfortunately, it didn't work, but their approach was really cool, where they were attempting to create wheat that would repel the aphids that attacked it by using a chemical signal that would tell the aphids, to signal danger, that they should go somewhere else. If this had worked, this would have prevented who knows how many millions of aphid deaths. And vegans who are concerned about insect life, that should be something that they're excited about. Now, this project is the original field trials failed. It did not work the way that they had hoped, but the project is ongoing, and they're trying different approaches to the way that the plants release these substances that signal to the aphids that they should take off, and hopefully they can find a way to make this work, and vegans should be really excited about it. So climate change is something that is a concern to everybody, and especially vegans. Vegans are really mindful of the way that climate is impacting animals. We talk about polar bears not having Arctic ice to hunt on, ringed seals that don't have snow they use to build shelters for their pups, warming streams affecting fish growth rates and their oxygen levels and making them more susceptible to disease and parasites. We talk about bleaching of coral reefs, destruction of that whole ocean habitat and the effect that it has on animals and individual animal suffering. Agriculture, different numbers are thrown around, but we're using this number from the UN. It says agriculture and land use is responsible for up to 1/3 of greenhouse gas climate change. And so that's an area where, by using GMO technology, we can improve the greenhouse gas footprint of agriculture, and we can slow down these effects. Nitrogen runoff is another concern for vegans. Nitrogen is a really important component for farmers trying to grow crops for us. Unfortunately, it leaches out of the soil. It gets in our waterways. It can create these kinds of dead zones where fish and aquatic wildlife can't survive. There are some really innovative approaches to creating plants that are better, more efficient at using nitrogen. And this will make it so that we don't need to put as much nitrogen into the soil for them to grow. They're going to get it out more effectively. That's going to reduce the amount of nitrogen that ends up going to streams and causing these kinds of scenes. Vegans are always very concerned about methane being produced by cows and the climate impact of animal agriculture. A lot of vegans don't realize that rice is also a major contributor to methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. There is a GMO approach to creating rice. I think it actually already exists, a GMO rice that creates less of a methane impact. And so if we are concerned about methane from cows, we also ought to be concerned about methane from rice, and we ought to embrace technological innovation that can reduce that. So there's a lot of arguments surrounding glyphosate and herbicide tolerance and the use of herbicides. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I just want to briefly point out that it's not all bad news. There's some valid concerns about how people are using herbicides and pesticides in farming, but at the same time, I think people need to know that glyphosate resistance in particular has really helped to reduce the use of some chemicals that are way more toxic and have a much bigger footprint on the environment. They also help reduce greenhouse gas by making it so that farmers don't need to till. no-till farming has become huge in the United States and Canada due to the proliferation of herbicide-tolerant crops, and that's made a difference when it comes to mitigating climate change. So, another interesting use for genetic modification and biotechnology is in medicine, and there are some specific things that vegans might be more concerned about more than the general public, like, for example, the flu block eggless vaccine. A lot of vaccines are developed using chicken eggs. The flu block eggless vaccine uses sort of an immortalized line of insect egg cells, so the impact on animals is greatly reduced through biotech using this technology. We're also starting to be able to create vaccines that are grown directly in the plants. And that removes all animal ingredients. That's something really exciting for vegans. And beyond that, just in terms of social justice, putting vaccines directly into plants bypasses the need for sterile syringes, bypasses the need for expensive refrigeration, and can bypass the need for multiple injections. So this is something not just from a vegan perspective, but from a social justice perspective that we can be happy about. Biotech and specifically GMO technology has given us treatments to Ebola. That was a pretty interesting story. We had Ebola outbreaks recently that were able to be successfully treated by these drugs created by GMOs. And we have this mosquito problem that Florida just voted on in the election, actually. They're using genetic modification to limit mosquito populations, or hypothetically, they could use GMO technology if they decide to implement it. People should understand that mosquitoes as a vector for disease is not just a problem for humans, but mosquitoes are also biting and spreading diseases amongst animals and wildlife. So that should be a concern for vegans as well. Some vegans might be concerned about the mosquitoes' sort of role in any individual ecosystem and worried about sort of creating suffering down the line if we reduce their populations or remove them. I think that the vegans should understand that there are thousands of species of mosquitoes. This is the only control method that we can reliably just target one of them, specifically the Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is responsible for Zika and some of these diseases that are in the news in the United States. That specific mosquito is not native to North or South America. It's home to a very small piece of land over by the Mediterranean. It doesn't have a natural ecosystem role. The ecosystem is going to have mild, if any, impact if we're able to reduce the numbers of these mosquitoes or remove them. So vegans are concerned about a lot of social justice issues, and we want to point out that GMOs have a lot of potential for empowerment, of people who are not as well off as we are privileged to be in the United States. And I'm speaking right now with a room full of people who come from countries where this kind of technology is relevant, and I look forward to having conversations with you all and understanding better situations in your countries. But our position is that GMO technology can really help with things like getting enough food to people in areas where they currently don't have enough. This WEMA project, the Water Efficient Maize for Africa, has been in the news recently. This is a really cool collaboration between private and public researchers. And it's headed up by a Kenyan-based organization. So I think this challenges the narrative that a lot of vegans and other people in the United States have when it comes to spreading GMOs in the developing world. They think that this is sort of Monsanto coming in and trampling over everybody and taking all their stuff and running away. I want people to know, I want people in the United States specifically to know that, like you guys here in this room, the developing world has its own scientists that are capable of creating solutions to their own problems. This isn't necessarily multinationals being let loose to go plunder. Projects like this show that on-the-ground operations in Africa or in Southeast Asia can create their own solutions, and this is something we should embrace and we should cheer for. So along those lines, let's talk for a minute about big business, because as vegans especially, and a lot of other people are concerned about these big multinational corporations consolidating wealth and power, and I'm concerned about this as well. I in no way want to sweep these concerns under the rug. This is potentially problematic. People are concerned about patents on seeds. I think what people don't understand is that virtually all new varieties of plants, whether GMO or not, are protected by intellectual property rights. So this isn't specifically a GMO issue. If there is an issue with intellectual property rights and patents, let's be honest and talk about that as a legal system and not as a GMO issue. In fact, it turns out that the anti-GMO narrative can actually benefit large businesses and large multinationals. In 2011, the average cost from development to marketing of a GMO crop in the United States was $136 million. Okay, 26% of that, or $35.1 million, was specifically from regulatory testing and registration. So, and you consider that the average time frame from starting a project to getting it commercialized is 13 years, and you're talking about $136 million. Under that system, nobody can afford to go into GMO seed business unless they've got a whole lot of money up front and don't need to see a return on investment for a very long time. So that excludes a lot of smaller entities and maybe even public entities from competing. So, the problem with that, so as technology advances, it becomes cheaper, and we've got new things like CRISPR that really reduce costs when it comes to genetic modification. So some of those costs are coming down, but when it comes to those regulatory costs, those don't come down sort of naturally the way that the other costs do. We have to approach this from the regulatory standpoint. Now, those regulations are informed by public policy as much as they're informed by actual scientists. So a prevalent anti-GMO narrative is going to influence politicians to keep those standards sort of unnecessarily impossibly high to where it prevents people from competing. So, this really benefits big multinationals to not have to compete with smaller operations who can't afford the initial investment and the time frame to jump over these regulatory hurdles. I think it would be fantastic if we could have more funding for public research and public development of GMO crops to address agricultural and health problems. But public perception also affects funding for public research. I think about Cornell developing the disease-resistant trait for papaya. I would love to see this kind of work being done in universities all across the country in a way where the end product could actually be distributed to farmers and put in places where it could be used. But with the current political climate and current sort of anti-GMO narratives that dominate discussions, we're not ever going to be able to see this world become a reality. Science in one area is not insulated from other spheres of science. So we're very excited about scientific advancement in general. These images show where we used to get our insulin drugs from. You can see this guy, he's got a bunch of cow or pig pancreases, and he's grinding them up, and that's where our treatment for diabetic people used to come from. This was standard from like the 1920s through the late 70s. Around that time, scientists were able to genetically modify bacteria using human DNA so that they produced insulin for diabetics. And this insulin is safer for humans because it uses human DNA instead of pig or cow DNA. You avoid any problems with allergies. You avoid the kinds of contamination that you can imagine happen when you throw a bunch of organs into a grinder like that. I think most vegans would be horrified to learn that it took 2 tons of pig parts to extract 8 ounces of purified insulin using this method. And thanks to GMO technology, we've moved past this. And we talked a little bit earlier about animal testing. Biotechnology and recombinant DNA technology have helped us provide some alternatives. Currently somewhat limited in their usefulness, but it's a start, and hopefully this can become more and more useful as we go down the line. You're looking at these chips, these organ chips, which are a start to replace the 17 to 100 million animals that are used in scientific research every year. And this includes primates, mice, rats, frogs, dogs, cats, guinea pigs, fish, hamsters, a lot of really nice, adorable little animals that we vegans are concerned about, that we are really hopeful that they can be taken out of the system when the technology emerges, and we're on that track. Or at least we can be if we can embrace technology and move forward with it. So, wrapping it all up, I think as vegans, we've got to insist on consistent and logical application of our standards. We've got to insist on truth. Justice for humans and animals both requires truth. I think we have a moral obligation to support biotech sciences that can benefit the environment while reducing suffering and exploitation of human and non-animal or non-human animals alike. So last thing, I just want to thank the Vegan GMO team and acknowledge help from Dave, Kelly, Jamie, Jordan, and the rest of the team in putting together this presentation and researching it in the visuals. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. That is the end of my presentation. So we'll take some questions now or go to lunch or whatever you guys want to do.
Thank you very much, DC, for that insightful presentation. So, time for question, comments.
You mentioned that for 19 years you've been a vegan.
Yes.
You look really fit. And
Thank you.
You must be getting supplements, because without nutritional supplements, you probably would not be standing here.
Well,
B12, you mentioned,
yes.
and you don't get that in plant sources.
Right, it's difficult to
So
get
I'm
that
just
from plant sources.
wondering, nutritional supplements so that people can be healthy like you would be a big issue in developing countries. has the vegan society looked at a total nutritional package when you're promoting veganism? And how much would that cost? Because the supplements are expensive,
Sure.
right? My second part is to deal with, the issue of ethics. You mentioned about animal models should not be used. The vegan society discards that. Now, given that almost majority of the GMOs which are in the market have gone through skin irritation, allergenicity tests. Without that, you can't get a product into the market. Now you're eating that. I'm just wondering, as a society, since these products are already out and they have been tested in animal models, would you consider, you must be eating it now, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're talking that animal models should not be used.
Right. So
I'm just wondering, you're talking two sides of the coin.
right. So we should be clear that the vegan society, the quote that I posted earlier, the vegan society is sort of a starting point, but not necessarily reflective of all vegans. And our organization, Vegan GMO, is not affiliated with them in any way. And in fact, we have some problems with some of their positions when it comes to transgenic technology. But with regard to animal testing, not every single GMO crop currently available on the market has been tested on animals. If a new crop has a novel protein or a compound that hasn't been evaluated for safety in human diets, then you can make a case for the necessity of performing the kind of animal tests for allergens and the other things that you mentioned. Some vegans may recognize that as a legitimate need and may be willing to accept that. Like we said, the practice of veganism is not necessarily about purity, but about being practical with what's possible. So if it's determined that a certain amount of animal testing is necessary, like the circumstances that you brought up, I think a lot of vegans might be willing to accept that, especially in the early stages of the technology's development. As the technology progresses, like now, for us to be doing animal testing on the BT that's been used for 20 years, for example, seems a little silly, and that's the kind of testing that we really want to see done away with. With regard to your first question about nutritional supplementation in the developing world, I want to be really clear. I'm not trying to tell the developing world that they all need to go vegan right now. I had an interesting conversation last year here at Cornell with, it was during our executive week, and I believe it was a gentleman from Ghana, asked me, do you want everybody in my country to become vegan, and how are we going to survive if we don't have access to the kinds of things that you vegans have access to here in the United States? My response to him was that first and foremost, I want to work towards food independence, food security for these countries. Once the entire world has access to abundant food resources, that makes it a lot more practical to start talking about some of these ethical considerations with regard to animals' roles in our nutritional system. So if a human being's basic needs can't be met in the place that they live without animal inputs, then I would say that it is not possible and practical for them to be vegan. I want to work toward a world where it is possible and practical for everybody to start to think in those ethical terms. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. And you brought up other good points about supplementation and how much it's going to cost. I don't take any supplements other than B vitamins, as I mentioned. I'm lucky to live here where, Ithaca is a great, I don't live in Ithaca, I live in Oregon, but both Ithaca and Portland, Oregon are both really great towns for vegans. I was discussing this with Eric earlier today. We have the United States has this Thanksgiving holiday coming up, and we traditionally eat turkey for this holiday. And we're talking about how cultural a lot of our food choices are. And I mentioned that for vegans in the United States, it was awkward for a long time to go to your family's Thanksgiving meal and not participate in sort of this ritual consumption of turkey. But now we have this product called tofurkey, which is sort of an analog of turkey meat made from soy and wheat proteins. And it's textured to be the same, and it's got flavoring that makes it not that far off from the actual thing. So I want to recognize the privilege I enjoy as a vegan in the United States in having sort of convenient access to good nutrition and those kinds of things.
If I'm allowed? Sure. So because, one is the question of food availability. The other question is about malnourishment. Because if you look at the world as a whole, we got millions of people who are malnourished. And we understand that plant sources alone will not give you all the nourishment needs which a human body needs. So why can't the vegans go a little bit more and say, you're allowed to eat the egg, which gives you, all the proteins which you need, vitamin D and everything else which you showed. My only thing with veganism is plants alone will not give you the required nutrients for a human body. Because you're going to need, like you were taking B12. If you did not take B12, you could be having severe health issues. So
right.
Where are we going to get that balance?
Well, so
if you just go veganism, only plants, no dairy.
My first response would be that even though I don't get B12 from plants, I still am able to get it from non-animal sources. And a lot of the vitamin supplements that are out on the market are actually created, using genetically modified microorganisms. And so, this goes back to our approach. And what you're saying is exactly what I want to say to the vegans, in that, like you're pointing out, in a lot of the world, they need these animal products for complete nutrition. We want those people to have complete nutrition. We want vegans to embrace this technology because it will give more options. Like, for example, B vitamin fortification of a certain crop, or whatever micronutrients or macronutrients that are needed by a certain specific population, we can use biotechnology to fortify and give people plant-based foods that offer complete nutrition. And that's the kind of world we want to work towards. I'm not going to get mad. I'm not going to lecture somebody from the developing world who eats an egg, because that's the only way that they can get the required nutrition. I'm not going to be mad at that person at all. I hope to help them by making those kind of nutritional resources more available. Great. Thanks, guys.
We discussed this earlier on. I want to know the thinking. And maybe the world who believe in the tenets of Islam. And we also know that during our festive periods, we kill rams. As a good Muslim, you should kill ram and share to the people. And also a better, how do I satisfy my religious ethics and my moral or my ethical belief on being vegan? So how do I satisfy that? How do I please the two sides?
Yeah, so Eric and I had a really interesting conversation this morning over breakfast, talking about how our food choices come down to culture a lot of the times, and specifically the example that he brought up about a Muslim person killing a ram as part of a religious ritual, and whether or not it's possible for a vegan to be a good Muslim, for example, or to be a good member of whatever religious or cultural community that uses animals in their rituals. And this is a very interesting but complex topic, and I'm not sure we can tackle it all today. I told Eric that I know of some Muslim vegans whose interpretation of these kinds of rituals is, you know, it weighs heavily the idea that what God is really asking for in these sacrifices is to help provide for the poor and the needy. And I think a lot of vegans have, you know, in their own interpretation of their beliefs, have decided that they can also contribute to the well-being of the poor and the needy, you know, during these holy days with plant-based offerings, as well as they can with sort of ram's meat, for example. But you know, I'm in no position to tell any Muslim person what they should or shouldn't do. This is any individual has to grapple with these problems on their own and make their own decisions. But yeah, it's a really interesting conversation to have.
Sorry, this is a very basic, naive question, or I misheard you. You said that 17 to 100 million animals are used in animal testing per year?
Yes.
Is that right? It seems like a wide range, and I'm just not sure I'm going to stick around on this. Is that fluctuations each year or difficulty?
Yeah, I think that's looking at the last, our source we use, I think was looking at the last 10 years. And I think that it's not consistent year to year. Obviously, we're not doing the exact same research projects every single year, but it looks like it's trending upwards. So that, you know, that's a concern for vegans and vegetarians and anybody who cares about animals. You know, we'd like to be able to bring that down without the science suffering as a consequence of removing animals. We still want the science to progress. We just want to remove the suffering and the exploitation that is currently so prevalent.
The absence of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.